Sometimes the wilderness calls to us in ways we can't explain, and we have to decide whether to answer. For Riona Vale, that call came on a cold October morning when she heard something in the forest that stopped her heart, a cry that didn't belong to any creature she knew. She found a massive grey wolf trapped in quicksand, sinking fast and fighting to stay alive. Most people would have walked away, but when their eyes met, something passed between them that she couldn't ignore. And when she pulled that wolf free, she had no idea she was about to uncover a mystery buried in these mountains for generations. What did that wolf know that no one else did? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat at 7,200 feet, where the pines grew thick enough to block out the afternoon sun, and the air tasted like snow, even in summer. Riona Vale had lived there for 15 years, ever since she turned 20, and decided that the world below held nothing for her anymore. The structure itself was simple: 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that faced east to catch the first light. Her grandfather had built it with his own hands back in the 60s, and when he disappeared during what the town called a hunting accident, it had sat empty for 5 years before Riona claimed it as her own. She made her living as a tracker. Hunters paid good money for someone who could find elk in the high country, and the State Forestry Service called on her when hikers went missing. She knew these mountains the way some people knew city streets, every ravine, every game trail, every place where the wind changed direction and warned of coming storms. Her reputation had spread quietly over the years. People in Pinecrest, the logging town 40 minutes down the mountain road, called her reliable. They also called her strange, but she didn't mind that much. The morning routine never changed. She woke before dawn, started the fire, and made coffee in the old percolator that had belonged to her grandmother. While the water heated, she'd step onto the porch and listen. The forest had a language all its own, and she'd learned to speak it. The warning chatter of squirrels meant a predator nearby. The sudden silence of birds meant something larger moving through the canopy. The crack of a branch under weight told her whether it was deer, bear, or human. Each had their own rhythm, their own carelessness or caution. This particular October morning started no different than any other. The sky held that peculiar purple shade that came just before sunrise, and frost covered the wood railing where she rested her coffee mug. She'd planned to check her trail cameras in the northern section, where she'd been tracking a mountain lion for a wildlife biologist from the university. The cat had been making kills closer to town than usual, and they wanted to know if it was a male expanding territory or a female with cubs. But plans changed when you lived in the wilderness. You learned to adapt, to read the signs, to trust your instincts even when they didn't make logical sense. Riona went back inside and pulled on her hiking boots, heavy leather things that she'd resoled twice and would probably resole again. She layered up: thermal underwear, flannel shirt, fleece vest, and her grandfather's old canvas jacket that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and pine sap. Her pack held the essentials: water, first aid kit, fire starter, knife, rope, emergency blanket, and the 357 revolver she carried for bears. She'd only fired it twice in 15 years, both times into the air as warning shots. The walk to her truck took 10 minutes, down a path she'd worn smooth over the years. The vehicle itself was a 20-year-old Ford with 200,000 miles and an engine that started on the coldest mornings. She'd learned to do her own repairs because the nearest mechanic was in Pinecrest, and she didn't like making the trip more than once a week for supplies. Pinecrest itself had seen better days. The old lumber mill had closed down 8 years back when the timber contracts dried up, and half the storefronts on Main Street stood empty now. The population had dropped from 3,000 to maybe 800, mostly older folks who'd lived there all their lives and had nowhere else to go. There was talk of a developer wanting to buy up land for a resort. Some outsider named Vincent Thorne, who'd been nosing around, making offers that seemed too good and made people nervous. She parked in front of Brierley's general store. the only place in town that carried decent coffee and the hunting supplies she couldn't order online. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and the familiar smell of old wood and gun oil wrapped around her like a comfortable blanket. Owen Brierly stood behind the counter, reading a newspaper through bifocals that perched on the end of his nose. He was in his mid-60s, with white hair that he kept military short and hands that still looked strong, despite the arthritis he complained about. He'd run this store for 40 years, taking it over from his father, who'd taken it over from his father before that. The Brierlys had been in Pinecrest since the town was founded in 1887. "Morning, Riona," he said without looking up. "Coffee's fresh. Appreciate it." She poured herself a cup from the pot he kept going all day and added 2 sugars. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, exactly how she liked it. Owen folded his newspaper and studied her with the kind of attention that meant he had something on his mind. They developed an easy friendship over the years, built on mutual respect and an understanding that neither of them was much for small talk. When Owen spoke, it usually mattered. "You hear about the hunters?" He asked, "Which hunters?" 3 of them went up to Vale Hollow 2 days back. "Nobody's seen them since." Riona paused with her coffee halfway to her lips. Vale Hollow was bad country, steep ravines, unstable ground, and a reputation that kept most sensible people away. Her grandfather used to tell her stories about that place, warnings wrapped up in the kind of folklore that old-timers passed down. She'd always assumed they were just tales, meant to keep kids from wandering into dangerous terrain. "Search party going out?" she asked. "Tamsin's organizing one for tomorrow if they don't turn up today." Tamsin Cord was the local ranger, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who transferred up from Colorado 5 years back. She knew her job and didn't suffer fools. "They experienced?" Owen shrugged. 2 of them were. The 3rd was somebody's nephew from Seattle, first time hunting. They were after elk. Riona frowned into her coffee. Elk didn't go into Vale Hollow. The terrain was wrong, and something about that area made animals nervous. She'd noticed it herself on the few occasions she'd skirted the edges. The way birds didn't sing quite right, how the air felt heavier, thicker. She'd learned to trust those feelings. "I'll keep an ear out," she said, which was about as much as she could offer. She wasn't official rescue, and she had her own work to do. She bought her coffee, a box of rifle ammunition she didn't need but knew she'd use eventually, and a new whetstone for her knives. Owen rang her up and gave her the local discount he offered to the few remaining regulars. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. "Riona." His voice carried a weight that made her stop. "You be careful up there. My grandmother used to say that some parts of these mountains don't belong to us, never have. Vale Hollow's one of them." She met his eyes and saw something there, genuine concern, but also something else. Knowledge, maybe. The kind that came from family stories passed down through generations. "I'll be careful," she promised, and meant it. The drive back up the mountain gave her time to think. 3 missing hunters wasn't unheard of. People got lost, got hurt, sometimes did stupid things that got them killed. But Vale Hollow bothered her. It had always bothered her, if she was honest. Even her grandfather, who'd hunted and trapped every inch of these mountains, had told her to stay away from there. She remembered one conversation in particular, sitting on the porch of this very cabin when she was maybe 10 years old. He'd been teaching her how to read animal tracks in the dust, showing her the difference between a deer's delicate hoof print and the heavier impression of an elk. "Some places have their own rules," he'd said, his voice going quiet and serious. "Vale Hollow is one. You don't go there unless you have to, and if you have to, you don't go alone. You understand me, little bird?" He'd called her that, little bird, because she was always climbing trees and watching things from above. "Why?" she'd asked, the way children do. He'd been quiet for a long moment, packing tobacco into his pipe with careful fingers. "Because there are things in this world older than us, older than this town, older than the trees themselves. Most of the time they keep to themselves and we keep to ourselves. Vale Hollow is where they keep. We respect that." She'd nodded like she understood, but she hadn't, not really. Now, at 35, with 15 years of mountain living behind her, she still didn't understand. But she respected it anyway, because her grandfather had never steered her wrong about anything that mattered. Back at the cabin, she spent the afternoon preparing for the next day's work. She cleaned and oiled her rifle, organized her pack, and studied the topographical maps she kept in a drawer. The trail cameras could wait another day. Something about those missing hunters wouldn't leave her alone. As evening settled in and she made herself dinner, venison stew from a deer she'd taken last month, she found herself pulling out her grandfather's old journal. He'd been a meticulous record keeper, documenting every hunt, every trapline, every notable event in small, precise handwriting. She'd read through it a dozen times over the years, finding comfort in the familiar entries, but tonight she looked for something specific. She flipped through pages until she found entries from Vale Hollow, and there weren't many. Her grandfather had avoided that area, just like he'd told her to. The few times he mentioned it, his notes were cryptic, found tracks circling the hollow. Wrong pattern, wrong depth. Marked the stones and left. Heard the calling again last night. Stronger than before. The boundary must be weakening. Spoke with Owen's grandmother today. She remembers the last time. Says we have 20 years, maybe less. God help us if we're not ready. Riona read those entries 3 times, trying to make sense of them. What tracks? What calling? What boundary? And ready for what? She closed the journal and sat in the quiet of her cabin, listening to the fire crack and pop. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. This was her home, her sanctuary, the place where the world made sense because it followed natural laws. Predator and prey, season and weather, cause and effect. But reading her grandfather's words reminded her that maybe the world was bigger and stranger than she wanted to believe. That maybe some of those old stories had roots in truth, even if the truth was something people didn't talk about in daylight. She went to bed that night with questions circling her mind like ravens. She didn't know it yet, but the next morning would bring answers she wasn't prepared for, and would set in motion events that would change everything she thought she knew about these mountains, her family and herself. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, she dreamed of amber eyes watching her from the shadows, and a voice that might have been the wind calling her name. The cry came just after dawn, cutting through the morning mist like a blade. Riona was already awake, standing on her porch with coffee in hand, when she heard it. The sound stopped her mid-sip. It wasn't a howl, not exactly. It was something more desperate, more intelligent. A call for help that carried weight and meaning beyond simple animal distress. She set down her mug and listened. The forest had gone silent around the sound. No birds, no squirrels, nothing but that terrible cry echoing off the rock faces to the north. Toward Vale Hollow, every instinct she'd developed over 15 years told her to stay away. This wasn't her business. The search party would go out today, and they could handle whatever they found. She had no responsibility here, no obligation to investigate strange sounds coming from a place her grandfather had warned her to avoid. But the cry came again, weaker this time, and she found herself moving. She grabbed her pack, checked her revolver, and headed into the forest at a pace just short of running. The sound had come from perhaps 2 miles north, in rough country where the game trails petered out and the terrain got treacherous. She'd been near there before, but never into it, always honoring her grandfather's warning. Today, she broke that rule. The land changed as she moved deeper. The trees grew closer together, their trunks twisted in ways that seemed wrong. The undergrowth became thicker, thornier, catching at her clothes like grasping hands. And the silence pressed down like a physical thing, broken only by her own breathing and the crunch of her boots on dead leaves. She'd been tracking for 40 minutes when she smelled it, the thick, sulphurous stench of quicksand. There was a bog somewhere ahead, one of those treacherous pockets where water and decomposing vegetation created a soup that could swallow a full-grown elk and leave no trace. Riona slowed her approach, testing each step. The ground became softer, wetter. She pushed through a dense stand of thorn bushes and found herself at the edge of a clearing she'd never seen before. In the center, Maybe 30 feet away, a wolf was dying. It was massive, easily twice the size of any wolf she'd ever seen, with fur the color of storm clouds and eyes that glowed amber even in the dim morning light. The creature was chest deep in quicksand, its powerful legs churning uselessly as it fought to stay above the surface. The mud made obscene sucking sounds with each movement. Riona's first thought was that it couldn't be real. Wolves had been extinct in these mountains for decades. Her second thought was that even if it was real, she should leave it. Nature was cruel sometimes, and interfering rarely ended well. Then the wolf looked directly at her, and she heard her name, not in her ears. In her mind, clear as a bell, Riona. She froze, her rational mind rejecting what had just happened even as every hair on her body stood on end. Wolves didn't speak. They couldn't speak. This was stress, or lack of sleep, or maybe she'd hit her head on a branch and didn't remember. The wolf's eyes held hers, and she saw intelligence there. Not animal cunning, but true awareness, understanding, and something else, recognition, as if this creature knew her. "Help," came that impossible voice again, weaker now. "Please!" Riona's hands were shaking as she dropped her pack and pulled out her rope. She had maybe 60 feet of good climbing rope rated for 5,000 pounds. If she could get it around the wolf's chest, she might be able to create enough leverage to pull it free. Might. She tied one end to the trunk of the sturdiest pine she could reach, then fashioned a large loop in the other end. The wolf had stopped struggling, conserving energy, watching her with those amber eyes. It was sinking slower now, but still sinking. "I'm going to throw this to you," she said, feeling ridiculous talking to a wolf, but unable to stop herself. "You need to get it around your chest, under your front legs. Can you do that?" The wolf's head dipped once in what looked impossibly like a nod. Riona threw the loop. Her first attempt fell short. The second landed across the wolf's back, and she watched in amazement as the creature somehow maneuvered the rope with its mouth and front paws, working it under and around until it was positioned correctly. She'd seen smart dogs before. She'd seen ravens solve puzzles and bears open complex locks. But this was different. This was deliberate, almost human in its precision. "Hold on," she said, and began to pull. The rope went taut. The quicksand fought back, creating suction that seemed to double the wolf's weight. Riona braced her boots against a fallen log and pulled harder, feeling the muscles in her back and shoulders protest. The wolf helped as much as it could, using its front legs to claw at the mud, trying to create leverage. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. The wolf remained stuck, the rope cutting into Riona's gloved hands, the forest silent except for her labored breathing and the wet sounds of the quicksand. Then something gave. The wolf moved forward an inch, then another. The mud released its grip reluctantly, fighting for every foot. But slowly, so slowly, the creature began to emerge. Riona pulled until her arms screamed, until she tasted blood in her mouth from biting her cheek. Until finally, the wolf's hindquarters came free and it scrambled onto solid ground. For a long moment, they both just breathed. The wolf lay on its side, flanks heaving, covered in thick mud that steamed slightly in the cold air. Riona sat back against a tree, her whole body shaking from exertion and adrenaline. That's when she saw the collar. It was almost hidden beneath the mud and matted fur. But as the wolf shifted, morning light caught something metallic around its neck. Riona pulled herself to her feet and approached slowly, hands visible, making herself as non-threatening as possible. "Easy," she murmured. "I just want to see what that is." The wolf didn't move as she knelt beside it. Up close, the creature was even more impressive. Easily 150 pounds of muscle and bone, with teeth that could crush a femur and claws that had left deep gouges in the log as it pulled itself free. If it wanted to hurt her, she wouldn't stand a chance. But it lay still, watching her with those impossible eyes as she examined the collar. It was like nothing she'd ever seen. The metal was dark, almost black, but with a sheen that caught the light like oil on water. It was warm to the touch. Not just warm, but hot, like it had been sitting in summer sun, even though the morning air was cold enough to frost her breath. and carved into the surface were symbols she didn't recognize. Not words exactly, but marks that seemed to shift and move when she looked at them directly. Her grandfather's journal had mentioned symbols, marks on stones, boundaries. Riona's hands trembled as she traced the engravings with one finger. The metal grew hotter under her touch, and for just a moment she could have sworn she heard voices, distant, like echoes from the bottom of a well. They were speaking words she didn't understand, in a language that sounded like wind through caves. She jerked her hand back, and the sensation stopped. The wolf was watching her face, and again came that impossible voice in her mind. "You see it. You understand. I don't understand anything," Riona said aloud, her voice rough.
"What are you?"
"What is this?" But the wolf's eyes were already closing. The creature was exhausted, probably hypothermic from the cold mud, and needed rest. Riona made a decision that would have seemed insane an hour ago, but now felt inevitable. "Come on," she said. "My cabin's not far. You need to get warm and dry." She stood and gathered her rope, coiling it with automatic movements while her mind raced. The wolf struggled to its feet, shaky but mobile, and began to follow her. It limped slightly on its left hind leg, probably strained from fighting them. Quicksand. But kept pace as she started back the way she'd come. The walk back to her cabin took twice as long, with the wolf moving slowly. Riona found herself glancing back every few minutes, half expecting the creature to have disappeared like something from a dream. But it was always there, grey and massive and impossible, tracking her through the forest with preternatural quiet. When they reached her clearing, the wolf hesitated at the tree line. Riona opened her cabin door and looked back. "You coming or not?" The wolf's ears went forward, and it limped across the clearing and into her home. Riona shut the door behind them and leaned against it, trying to process what she'd just done. She'd brought a wolf, a possibly supernatural, definitely impossible wolf that had spoken in her mind, into her living space, into the cabin her grandfather had built. The wolf stood in the center of the room, dripping mud onto her floor, looking around with what seemed like curiosity. Its gaze lingered on the fireplace, then moved to the bookshelf where her grandfather's journal sat among old hunting magazines and field guides. "Right," Riona said, talking to herself as much as to the wolf. "Let's get you cleaned up." She spent the next hour heating water and using old towels to clean the worst of the mud from the wolf's coat. The creature stood patiently through the process, occasionally making small sounds that might have been contentment or simply exhaustion. As the mud came away, Riona could see that its fur was actually a beautiful silver grey, darker along the spine and lighter on the belly. And those eyes, they never stopped being unsettling. Too aware, too knowing, when she'd done what she could, she built up the fire and set out a bowl of water. The wolf drank deeply, then settled onto the rug in front of the fireplace with a sigh that sounded far too human. Riona sat at her small kitchen table, unable to take her eyes off the creature. She should call Tamsin. She should call animal control, or a wildlife expert, or somebody who would know what to do with an extinct animal that had appeared out of nowhere and somehow communicated with her mind. But she didn't reach for her phone. Instead, she pulled out her grandfather's journal and began reading more carefully, looking for any mention of wolves or collars or symbols. And as the morning turned to afternoon and the wolf slept by her fire, she started to piece together fragments of a story that had been hidden in plain sight for her entire life. A story about guardians and boundaries, about pacts made and promises kept, about her family's connection to these mountains that went deeper than simple love of wilderness, and about something in Vale Hollow that was supposed to stay sealed. Outside, clouds moved in from the north, and the first snow of the season began to fall. The wolf's ears twitched in sleep, and Riona read on, knowing that something fundamental had changed. The world she'd thought she understood, the simple world of predator and prey, of natural law and rational explanation, that world was gone. What replaced it was older, stranger, and far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The wolf. She'd started calling it Ash in her mind, for the color of its coat didn't leave. 3 days passed, and the creature remained in or near her cabin, moving with the casual confidence of something that belonged there. It slept by the fire at night and followed her on short walks during the day, always staying close, always watching. Riona spent those 3 days buried in her grandfather's journal, reading and rereading entries she'd previously skimmed over. Patterns emerged. References to the keeping and bound ones appeared throughout the later years of his life. He'd written about stones that marked boundaries, about cycles that repeated every few decades, about responsibilities passed down through bloodlines. On the 4th morning, she found the pendant. She'd been going through her grandfather's old trunk, a battered thing he'd kept locked in the back of the closet. She'd opened it only once before, shortly after claiming the cabin, and had found nothing but old clothes and hunting gear. But this time, motivated by what she'd read in the journal, she searched more carefully. The false bottom was cleverly done. You had to remove everything and press on the corners in a specific pattern. When it popped open, she found a small wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside the box lay a pendant on a simple leather cord. The metal was the same dark, oily-looking material as the wolf's collar, formed into a circular disc about the size of a silver dollar. More of those strange symbols were etched into its surface, and like the collar, it was warm to the touch. Beneath the pendant was a note in her grandfather's handwriting. "When the guardian returns, wear this. Trust your blood. Remember who you are." Riona lifted the pendant, and the moment it touched her skin, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Ash's head came up from where the wolf had been sleeping, ears forward, a low rumble building in its chest. Not a threat, a warning. She slipped the cord over her head, and the pendant settled against her breastbone with a weight that seemed to go deeper than physical. For a moment nothing happened. Then the metal grew cold, ice cold, and began to pull. Not physically, but directionally. Like a compass finding north, the pendant tugged her awareness toward the northwest, toward Vale Hollow. "You feel it too," she said to Ash, watching the wolf's reaction. The creature's eyes were fixed in the same direction, and that rumble continued, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Riona walked to the window. The pendant's pull grew stronger the closer she faced northwest, and weaker when she turned away. Some kind of guidance system, she realized. But guiding her toward what? A knock at the door made her jump. Ash was on its feet instantly, moving between her and the entrance with hackles raised. "Easy," she murmured, moving to answer it. Through the window, she could see Owen's truck in her clearing. She cracked the door open just wide enough to speak through. Owen stood on her porch, looking worried in the way that made his age show. Lines deep around his eyes, shoulders slightly hunched. "Morning, Riona. Mind if I come in? Got some news about those hunters." She glanced back at Ash, who had retreated to the corner near the fireplace, but was still tense and watching. "Actually, Owen, now's not a great time." He frowned, and she realized he could probably hear the strangeness in her voice. Owen might be in his 60s, but he wasn't slow. "You all right? You look like you haven't slept." "I'm fine. Just busy with some research." "What's the news?" Owen's frown deepened, but he accepted the deflection. "Search party found their camp yesterday. Torn to pieces, gear scattered, tent shredded. No sign of the men themselves, but they found blood. A lot of it." Riona's stomach clenched. "Animals. That's what Tamsin's calling it. Bear attack, probably." But he paused, choosing his words carefully. "My daddy used to say you could tell a lot by how animals kill. Bears are messy but purposeful. They eat what they kill. Whatever happened at that camp, it wasn't about food. It was about violence, about terror." The pendant against her chest grew colder, and she instinctively put her hand over it. Owen's eyes tracked the movement. "What's that you're wearing?" "Something of my grandfather's. Found it this morning." His expression changed. Something flickered across his face that looked like recognition, or maybe fear. "Can I see it?" Riona hesitated, then pulled the pendant out from under her shirt. Owen went pale. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered. "He gave it to you? Left it for me. Owen, what do you know about this?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the pendant like it might bite him. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with something that sounded like resignation. "My grandmother had one like it. She was a keeper of the old stories, the ones most folks forgot or stopped believing. She used to tell me things when I was young, things about these mountains, about responsibilities that got passed down whether you wanted them or not. He met Riona's eyes. Your grandfather was part of that. The keeping, they called it. And if he left you that pendant, it means he thought you'd need it. Means something's coming or already here. What's coming? But Owen was already backing away from the door, shaking his head. I've said too much. That's your burden to understand, not mine to explain. But Riona, be careful. Whatever happened to those hunters, I don't think it's over. He turned and walked back to his truck, moving faster than she'd seen him move in years. Within minutes, he was gone, leaving Riona standing in her doorway with more questions than answers. She shut the door and found Ash sitting in the middle of the room, watching her with those unnerving amber eyes. You want to tell me what's going on? She asked the wolf. In response, Ash walked to the door and scratched at it, a clear request to go outside. Riona grabbed her jacket and followed. The wolf led her into the forest, moving with purpose now, taking paths that seemed random, but that Riona's instincts told her were anything but. The pendant grew colder with each step, pulling her in the same direction Ash was heading. They walked for 20 minutes before Ash stopped at what looked like an ordinary boulder half buried in forest loam. The wolf sat and looked at her expectantly. Riona circled the boulder, examining it more closely. It was roughly 4 feet tall, covered in moss and lichen, completely unremarkable except there, on the north-facing side, barely visible beneath the growth, were symbols carved into the stone. The same symbols that marked the pendant and the wolf's collar. She knelt and brushed away moss with her fingers, revealing more of the carvings. They covered a square section about 2 feet across, deep grooves worn smooth by weather and time. How old was this thing? 100 years? 1,000? The pendant against her chest was so cold now it hurt, and when she touched the carved symbols, she felt that same dropping sensation she'd experienced in the cabin. The temperature plummeted. Her breath came out in clouds of frost. And for just a moment, she could have sworn she heard voices, dozens of them, speaking in that same unknown language, urgent and afraid. Then Ash growled, and the sensation broke. Riona stood quickly, looking around. The forest had gone silent again. That same oppressive quiet she'd felt in Vale Hollow. No birds, no insects. Nothing but the wind moving through the pines. This is a boundary marker, she said aloud, knowing somehow that she was right. One of the stones my grandfather wrote about. You're showing me where the boundaries are. Ash's tail moved once, a single deliberate wag that looked far too knowing. They spent the rest of the day finding more stones. Ash led her to 3 others, each one positioned at what seemed like compass points around Vale Hollow. Each stone bore the same symbols, and each one made the pendant react with that bone-deep cold. By the time evening came and they returned to the cabin, Riona understood one thing clearly. These markers formed a barrier of some kind, a seal, and her grandfather had been part of maintaining it. But why? What were they keeping sealed? That night, she built up the fire and sat with the journal again, this time reading with the knowledge of the stones, fresh in her mind. And slowly, piece by piece, a story emerged from the fragments. 200 years ago, when settlers first came to these mountains, they'd encountered something in Vale Hollow. The journal entries from that era were sparse. Her grandfather had been copying from even older sources, but they painted a picture of terror. People disappeared. Livestock died. Children had nightmares that left them screaming. The settlement had nearly failed before a group of women from the local indigenous tribe agreed to help. Together they'd performed some kind of ritual, a sealing. They'd bound something that lived in the hollow, trapped it behind barriers both physical and spiritual. And part of that binding required guardians, spirits given animal form to watch over the seal and warn if it weakened. The wolves. Riona looked up from the journal to find Ash watching her from the fireside. You're not just a wolf, she said. You're something else. Something that was bound to protect these mountains. She paused, a terrible thought forming. And if you're here, if you came to me, that means the seal is breaking. Ash's head lowered onto its paws. But those amber eyes never left her face. "The hunters," Riona continued, pieces falling into place. "They weren't killed by a bear. Something from the hollow got them. Something that shouldn't have been able to get out." She thought about what Owen had said, that whatever killed those men had done it with violence and terror, not hunger. And she thought about the symbols on the stones, about her grandfather's warnings, about the responsibility passed down through blood. "I'm supposed to help you," she realized. "That's what the pendant means. That's why he left it for me. I'm supposed to help you fix the seal." Ash stood and walked to her, resting its massive head on her knee. The gesture was so unexpectedly gentle, so full of what could only be called gratitude, that Riona felt tears prick her eyes. She placed her hand on the wolf's head, feeling the warmth beneath the thick fur, and made a decision that she knew would change everything. "All right," she said quietly. "Show me what I need to do." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and somewhere in the distance, from the direction of Vale Hollow, came a sound that might have been an animal cry, or might have been something far worse. The pendant grew cold against her skin, and Ash's ears flattened against its skull. Whatever was coming, they were running out of time to stop it. Morning brought fresh snow, and a visitor Riona hadn't expected. She was outside splitting wood when Tamsin Cord's Forest Service truck pulled into the clearing. The ranger stepped out, dressed in her standard uniform with a radio clipped to her belt and a serious expression on her weathered face. Ash had disappeared into the tree line the moment the truck appeared, silent as smoke. "Morning, Tamsin," Riona said, setting down her axe. "You're a long way from the station. Could say the same about you being a long way from town." Tamsin's eyes scanned the clearing, professional and thorough. "When's the last time you were down at Brierley's?" 4 days ago. Why?" "Because I've got 3 dead hunters, another 2 missing hikers as of yesterday, and a pattern of activity that centers on this part of the mountain." Tamsin pulled a folded map from her pocket and spread it on the hood of her truck. Red marks indicated the locations of incidents. "You see anything unusual up here?" "Hear anything?" Riona studied the map. The marks formed a rough circle around Vale Hollow, and her cabin sat at the eastern edge of that circle. She thought about the truth, the wolf in her cabin, the boundary stones, the pendant cold against her skin right now. But Tamsin dealt in facts and evidence, not folklore and impossible animals. "I've heard some strange sounds," Riona said carefully, "but nothing I could identify. These mountains make odd noises sometimes." Tamsin's eyes sharpened. "What kind of sounds?" "Crying, maybe, or screaming. Hard to tell with the wind." It wasn't entirely a lie. She had heard those things, though she'd attributed them to whatever was breaking free from the seal. "And you didn't think to report it?" "Report what? That the forest sounds scary at night?" "Tamsin, you know how it is up here. Every hunter who gets lost swears they heard voices. Every hiker who spooks a deer thinks they saw a monster." Riona kept her voice steady, reasonable. "I thought I was hearing things." Tamsin studied her for a long moment, and Riona had the uncomfortable feeling she wasn't buying the explanation entirely. The ranger had good instincts. It was what made her competent at her job. "I need you to come down to Pinecrest for a few days," Tamsin said finally. "I'm recommending evacuation of the high country until we figure out what's happening. Could be a rogue bear, could be something else. But I want civilians out of the potential danger zone. I appreciate the concern, but I'm not leaving my home. Riona, I've lived here 15 years. I know how to handle myself, and I know these mountains better than any bear does." She softened her tone slightly. "Besides, you might need someone up here keeping eyes and ears open." "I'll call if I see anything worth reporting." Tamsin didn't look happy, but she nodded. "Fair enough. But you keep that radio on, and you check in twice a day, morning and evening. Miss a check-in, and I'm sending people up here whether you like it or not. Deal?" After Tamsin left, Riona went back inside to find Ash had returned and was sitting in front of the fireplace, looking agitated. The wolf paced back and forth, occasionally going to the door and scratching, then returning to pace some more. "I know," Riona said. We need to figure out what's happening before more people die. She pulled out the journal again, and this time focused on the entries about the seal itself. Her grandfather had written about a ritual called the keeping that required regular renewal. Every 50 years, someone from the bloodline had to strengthen the boundary stones, reinforce the spiritual barriers that kept whatever was in Vale Hollow contained. According to the journal, her grandfather had performed the ritual 50 years ago, in 1975, which meant the next renewal was due. She counted backward, right about now. But her grandfather had disappeared, died, everyone said, in what they called a hunting accident 25 years ago. Had he tried to perform an early renewal, or had something else happened? She was still reading when she heard vehicles outside. Multiple vehicles. Riona looked out the window to see Owen's truck, followed by a newer SUV she didn't recognize. Owen got out, along with a man in an expensive outdoor jacket that had probably never seen actual wilderness. The stranger was in his 40s, tall and fit, with the kind of confidence that came from money and success. She met them on the porch, very aware of Ash hiding in the back room. "Riona," Owen said, and she could hear apology in his voice. "This is Vincent Thorne. He wanted to talk to you about your property." So this was the developer everyone had been whispering about. Up close, Vincent Thorne had sharp eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach them. "Miss Vale," he said, extending a hand. "I've heard a lot about you. The legendary mountain woman who lives where no one else dares." Riona didn't take the offered hand. "My property's not for sale, Mr. Thorne. You can save your pitch. I haven't made an offer yet. Don't bother." Thorne's smile widened, but it was the kind of smile a shark might make. "I admire directness. Let me be equally direct. I'm planning a development that will bring jobs and revenue to Pinecrest. A resort and spa that will put this town back on the map. But I need access to certain parts of the mountain, and your property sits right in the middle of the most valuable section." The answer's still no. "I'm prepared to offer you 3 times market value. Enough money to buy a place anywhere you want. Live comfortably for the rest of your life." "I'm already living where I want." Thorne's expression hardened slightly. "Miss Vale, I'm trying to be neighborly here. But with or without your cooperation, this project is moving forward. The county is very interested in the tax revenue, and I have lawyers who are very good at finding ways to acquire necessary land." Riona felt her temper rise, but kept her voice level. "You can have all the lawyers you want. This land has been in my family for 3 generations, and it's staying in my family. Now get off my property." Owen shifted uncomfortably. "Riona, maybe you should at least hear him out. Owen, whose side are you on here?" The old man looked pained. "I'm trying to help. The town needs this, and you can't live up here alone forever. Watch me." Thorne pulled a business card from his pocket and set it on the porch railing. "Think about it. I'll be in town for another week. When you change your mind, give me a call." "I won't change my mind. Everyone has a price. Miss Vale, I just haven't found yours yet. They left." And Riona watched the vehicles disappear down the mountain road with a sick feeling in her stomach. Something about Vincent Thorne bothered her beyond the obvious. The way he'd looked at her land, like he knew something about it. Like his interest went deeper than just development potential. She picked up his business card, intending to throw it away, and froze. On the back, someone had drawn a symbol. The same symbol that appeared on the boundary stones. Ash emerged from the cabin and pressed against her leg, a low growl rumbling through its body. "He knows," Riona said quietly. "Somehow he knows about the seal." That night she couldn't sleep. The pendant was ice cold against her skin, and through the window she could see strange lights moving in the distance, toward Vale Hollow. Not flashlights, something else. Something that glowed with a sickly green luminescence and moved in patterns that made her eyes hurt to follow. She dressed in warm layers and grabbed her rifle. Ash was already at the door waiting. "Show me," she said. The wolf led her into the forest, moving fast now, no longer cautious. They covered ground quickly, heading northwest toward the hollow. The pendant grew colder with each step, and the air itself seemed to thicken, become harder to breathe. They found the boundary stone 20 minutes later, and Riona's heart sank. The stone was toppled, lying on its side with a crack running through the carved symbols. And covering it was a substance she couldn't identify, black and oily. It seemed to move of its own accord, pulsing like something alive. She knelt beside the stone, and the smell hit her, sulfur and rot and something underneath that was worse. Something that smelled like fear itself, if fear could have a scent. When she touched the stone, the vision hit her like a physical blow. She saw her grandfather, younger than she'd ever known him, standing at this very spot with others, men and women in clothes from decades past. They were performing a ritual, speaking words in that unknown language, their hands joined around the boundary marker. Light blazed from the stone, pure and white, and she felt the power of what they were doing, the binding, the sealing, the promise to keep the darkness contained. Then the vision shifted, and she saw the same stone weeks ago under a dark moon. A figure in a hooded cloak approached with tools and purpose. She couldn't see the face, but she watched as they methodically damaged the carvings, weakening the seal. And as the stone cracked, something on the other side pressed against the barrier, testing it, hungry for freedom. The vision released her, and she fell backward, gasping. Ash was there immediately, supporting her weight, keeping her from collapsing entirely. "Someone's breaking them on purpose," she said when she could speak. "Someone wants whatever's in there to get out." She thought of Vincent Thorne and his too knowing smile. Thought of Owen's strange behavior and his insistence she should sell. Thought of the symbol on the business card. One of them was the traitor. Maybe both. And if 5 stones were already broken, that meant only 2 remained intact. 2 barriers between the world she knew and whatever nightmare waited in Vale Hollow. Riona stood on shaking legs and looked at Ash. "We need to protect the remaining stones. Can you find them?" The wolf's response was to turn and lope deeper into the forest. Riona followed, running now, the rifle heavy across her back and the pendant like ice against her heart. Behind them, in the hollow, something screamed, a sound of triumph and hunger that echoed off the mountains and sent every animal in the forest running for their lives. Riona returned to her cabin at dawn to find the door standing open and her possessions scattered across the floor. Someone had been here, and they hadn't been careful about hiding their intrusion. Books pulled from shelves, drawers emptied, even the floorboards pried up in places. They'd been searching for something. Her first thought was the journal, and relief flooded through her when she found it still hidden in the compartment beneath her grandfather's trunk. They'd missed the false bottom. But other things were gone. The iron pendant was still around her neck, safe. But maps had been taken, and most concerning, several pages had been torn from the journal itself, pages she'd read just days before about the boundary stones and the renewal ritual. Ash prowled through the cabin, sniffing at the disturbance, hackles raised. The wolf's behavior told Riona what she already suspected. Whoever had been here knew exactly what they were looking for. She was examining the damage when Owen's truck appeared in her clearing. The old man stepped out slowly, moving like every joint pained him, and even from a distance, Riona could see he looked worse than yesterday. His face was grey, his hands trembling visibly. "I tried to stop them," he said before she could speak. "Tried to warn you. But the compulsion, it's getting stronger, Riona. I can barely fight it anymore." "Who was here, Owen?" "Thorne, and some men he's brought in from outside. They know about the journal. No, you've been researching the seal." Owen's voice was strained, each word seeming to cost him effort. "I need to show you something I should have shown you years ago." He reached into his truck and pulled out a worn leather satchel, the same one Riona remembered seeing in his store office. He handed it to her with shaking hands. "My grandmother's records. Everything the keepers have known about Vale Hollow for 200 years. Take it, study it. Because I don't know how much longer I can resist, and when I fall, when the entity takes complete control, you'll need to know everything." Riona took the satchel and led him inside. Owen sank into a chair, and for a long moment just sat there, breathing hard like he'd run a marathon. Then he pulled up his sleeve and Riona saw the brand for the first time. It was worse than she could have imagined. The symbol burned into his shoulder was one she recognized from the boundary stones, but inverted, corrupted. The skin around it was angry red and seemed to pulse with its own sickly light. As she watched, the mark flared brighter and Owen gasped in pain. 40 years I've carried this, he said through gritted teeth. 40 years of fighting what it wants me to do. Tell me everything, Riona said. From the beginning, and Owen did. He told her about being 25 and desperate, about his father's death and the failing store and a family he couldn't support, about the dream that hadn't been a dream, where something from Vale Hollow had offered him prosperity in exchange for small favors, about accepting without understanding the true cost. For the first 10 years, I didn't even realize what I was doing, he said. The task seemed meaningless. Move a rock here, scratch a mark there. It wasn't until my grandmother was dying that she told me what I'd really been doing. Breaking the seal, weakening the boundary stones, helping something evil prepare to break free. He told her about trying to resist, about the blackouts that came when he fought too hard, about waking in the forest with no memory, but dirt under his nails and fresh damage to the stones he was supposed to protect, about watching the other keepers die or move away or simply give up, until only he remained to carry the burden of knowledge and the guilt of betrayal. Vincent Thorne showed up 6 months ago, Owen continued. At first I thought he was just another developer, but then I saw how he looked at the mountain at Vale Hollow specifically, and I knew. He has the same mark I do, but his is different, darker. He didn't stumble into his bargain like I did. He sought it out, made his deal willingly, with full knowledge of what he was serving. Riona thought about Thorne's business card, about the symbol drawn on the back. He's here to finish breaking the seal. Yes, and I'm afraid I'm going to help him whether I want to or not. Owen's face twisted with anguish. The compulsion is so strong now I can barely think straight. Every minute I'm fighting the urge to drive to those last 2 stones and destroy them. How many are left? 2? The eastern stone at Granite Ridge and the southern stone by Blackwater Creek. He met her eyes. If both of those fall, the seal breaks completely. And what's in Vale Hollow, the devouring, my grandmother called it, will be free to consume everything. Riona opened the satchel and began sorting through the contents. Photographs, journals, hand-drawn maps, newspaper clippings dating back more than a century. The accumulated knowledge of generations of keepers, all pointing to the same truth. Something ancient and terrible was imprisoned in Vale Hollow, and only the boundary stones kept it contained. One document caught her attention, a hand-drawn map showing the 7 stone. Locations and what were labeled as thin places where the supernatural bled through into the physical world. The thin places formed a pattern, and when she compared it to the locations of the recent deaths and disappearances, the correlation was exact. The entity is already reaching through, she said, using the thin places where the seal is weakest, and it will only get worse as more stones fall. Owen stood, his movements jerky and uncontrolled. I need to go. Need to get away from here before he screamed and grabbed his shoulder. The brand blazed so bright, Riona had to look away, and when she looked back, Owen's eyes had gone distant and empty. He turned toward the door, walking with mechanical precision. Clearly, no longer in control of his own body, Ash moved to block his path, and for a moment, the wolf and the corrupted man faced each other in terrible silence. Then Owen's eyes cleared slightly, just enough for his true self to show through. "Stop me," he whispered. "Please, don't let me destroy those stones." But even as he spoke, his body was moving again, pushing past Ash, heading for his truck. Riona grabbed his arm, but he was stronger than he should have been, empowered by the entity's control. He shook her off easily and kept walking. "I'm sorry," Owen said, and she couldn't tell if it was really him speaking or the thing controlling him. "I'm so sorry for everything." He drove away, and Riona knew exactly where he was going. To the boundary stones, to finish the work he'd been forced to do for 40 years. She looked at Ash. "Can you track him? Slow him down without hurting him." The wolf's amber eyes held hers, and she felt understanding pass between them. Ash bolted out the door and disappeared into the forest, taking a shortcut that would get him to the southern stone before Owen's truck could navigate the mountain roads. Riona grabbed her rifle and the satchel of records. She needed help, and there was only one person she could think of who might understand what was happening and have the authority to do something about it. Tamsin Cord. The ranger answered on the second ring. "Riona, I was about to call you. You missed your morning check-in. Tamsin, I need you to listen very carefully and trust me, even though what I'm about to say sounds impossible." Riona kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Owen Briley is headed to Blackwater Creek right now, and he's going to damage historical markers there. I need you to intercept him and keep him away from that area." "Historical markers? Riona, what are you talking about?" "The boundary stones, the ones that mark sacred indigenous territory. Someone's been destroying them, and Owen is being forced to help whether he wants to or not." It was the truth, just without the supernatural elements Tamsin wouldn't believe. "Please, just trust me and stop him from reaching Blackwater Creek." There was a pause. Then Tamsin's professional voice came through. "I'm already in my truck. Give me his license plate number." Riona recited it from memory. "And Tamsin, be careful. He's not himself right now. Don't try to reason with him. Just keep him away from the stones." "Understood." "Where will you be?" "Protecting the other site. The one at Granite Ridge. Riona, I'll explain everything later. I promise. Just stop Owen." She hung up and grabbed her pack, loading it with everything she might need. The records from Owen's grandmother went in first, wrapped carefully in waterproof material. Then rope, first aid supplies, emergency rations, and extra ammunition for her rifle. The pendant against her chest was ice cold, colder than she'd ever felt it. And when she looked toward Vale Hollow, she could see darkness gathering there, despite the morning sun, shadows that moved wrong, that seemed to reach toward the valley like grasping fingers. The entity knew they were close to breaking free, knew that only 2 barriers remained, and it was throwing everything it had into destroying those final stones. Riona stepped out onto her porch and looked at the mountains she'd called home for 15 years. At the cabin her grandfather had built with his own hands. At the forest that had been her sanctuary and her purpose. If she failed today, all of it would be consumed. Not just her home, but the entire valley. Everyone in Pinecrest, everything for miles around would become feeding grounds for something that had been hungry for 200 years. She couldn't let that happen. She climbed into her truck and started the engine, heading toward Granite Ridge and the eastern boundary stone. Behind her the cabin stood empty and violated, and somewhere in the forest Ash was racing to stop Owen from completing his terrible task. The final battle for the seal had begun, and Riona Vale, the last of her bloodline, the inheritor of duties she'd never asked for, was the only thing standing between the world she knew and the darkness that waited to devour it all. Owen returned the next morning with something wrapped in oilcloth. His hands trembled as he set the bundle on Riona's kitchen table, and she could see the brand on his shoulder glowing faintly through his shirt, an angry red that pulsed with its own sick light. "I'm fighting it as hard as I can," he said, his voice strained. "But I don't have much time before it takes control again. You need to see this now." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a braided rope about 3 feet long. But it wasn't made of ordinary materials. Hair, both human and animal, was woven together with sinew and what looked like silver thread, creating a pattern that made Riona's eyes water if she looked at it too long. The whole thing emanated a faint warmth, like it was alive. "What is it?" she asked. "The binding cord. My grandmother kept it hidden all these years, passed down from the original seal makers. She gave it to me before she died, made me promise to give it to your grandfather when the time came. But he disappeared before I could." Owen touched the cord with reverence and fear. "This is what they used in the first ritual, what bound the guardians to their task, and what you'll need if you're going to renew the seal." Riona picked up the cord, and the moment her skin touched it, she felt a jolt of recognition. The same energy that flowed through the pendant and the boundary stones lived in this woven rope. Power, ancient and patient and waiting for someone to use it. "How do I use it?" I don't know all the details, but my grandmother said it requires a willing sacrifice from the bloodline. The cord binds spirit to purpose, flesh to promise. Owen's eyes were desperate. She also said it can rebind what's been broken. Not just the seal, but people too. People like me who've been marked and used. You want me to try to free you from the brand? No, it's too late for that. The mark has grown too strong, rooted too deep. But maybe, he paused, choosing words carefully. Maybe you can use the cord to bind me to helping you instead of helping it. Give me a chance to make things right before the end. Riona understood what he was really asking. A chance at redemption. A way to die with honor, instead of as a traitor to everything his grandmother had taught him. There's more you need to know, Owen continued. He pulled a worn leather satchel from under his coat and emptied it onto the table. Old photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings, and handwritten journals tumbled out. My grandmother's records. Everything the keepers have known about Vale Hollow for 200 years. Riona spread the materials out and began to read. The story that emerged was more detailed and more horrifying than anything in her grandfather's journal. The entity sealed in Vale Hollow wasn't just some mindless monster. It was old, older than the mountains themselves, and it had intelligence, cunning. It fed on fear and pain, growing stronger with each person it touched, each life it consumed. The indigenous tribes had called it the Devouring, because that's what it did. It devoured everything it touched, leaving nothing but emptiness behind. 200 years ago, when the seal was first created, it had already killed dozens of people. The ritual that bound it had required the willing sacrifice of 7 people, one from each of the founding families of the settlement. They'd given their lives to create the barrier, and their spirits had become the guardians. The wolves, 7 families, Riona said. 7 guardians. 7 boundary stones, and 5 stones are broken, which means 5 guardians are gone, dead or dispersed or consumed. We don't know which. Owen pointed to Ash, who sat in the corner watching them. That wolf is one of the 2 remaining. The last defenders, and the other guardian? No one's seen it in 20 years. Might be dead too. Riona looked at the photographs, grainy black and white images of the original settlers. Stern-faced men and women who'd known they were fighting something beyond their understanding. One photo showed a group of 7 people standing around a fire, holding hands, their faces set with determination. Her great-great-grandmother was among them. They knew they were going to die, she said quietly. They knew, and they did it anyway, because the alternative was letting that thing destroy everything they'd built. Everyone they loved, Owen's voice cracked. And now it's happening again, and I'm part of the reason why. Riona spent the rest of the day studying her grandmother's records, while Owen sat in her cabin, fighting the compulsion that tried to drive him toward the remaining boundary stones. She could see the struggle in every line of his body, the way his hands clenched and unclenched, the sweat on his forehead despite the cold, the occasional jerking movements as if invisible strings were pulling at him. Ash stayed close to Owen, and Riona realized the wolf was helping somehow. When the old man's eyes went distant and his body started to rise against his will, Ash would press against him, and that amber gaze would lock with his. The compulsion would weaken, at least temporarily. The wolf can fight it, Owen said during one of these moments. Not for long, but enough to give me a few more hours. Your grandfather could do the same before he died. It's something about the bloodline connection. You all have power over what the entity can do. That gave Riona an idea. If her blood had power over the entity, maybe she could use that to her advantage. Maybe that's what the ritual was really about, not just sacrifice, but taking control. Binding the devouring to her will, the way the original 7 had bound it to the land. She found confirmation in one of her grandmother's journal entries. The binding is both ways. We give ourselves to contain it, but in doing so we gain dominion over it. While the seal holds, it cannot act against our bloodlines directly. But this protection weakens with each generation that fails to renew the pact. Her grandfather had tried to renew it and failed, had died in the attempt. which meant the protection was gone, the connection severed, and when the seal broke completely, the entity would be free to act without restriction, unless Riona completed what her grandfather had started. As evening approached, Owen's condition worsened. The brand on his shoulder was glowing brighter now, visible even through his shirt, and his struggles against the compulsion were getting weaker. "You need to leave," he told her, his voice thick with effort. "I can feel it pulling at me. In another hour, maybe less, I won't be able to resist. I'll go to those stones and I'll break them, and there won't be anything I can do to stop myself. Then we tie you up. Keep you here until this is over. It doesn't work that way. The compulsion will make me hurt myself, hurt others, do whatever it takes to get free. I've seen it happen before." Owen stood on shaking legs. "I'm leaving now while I still can. Going down to Pinecrest, where there are people who can stop me if necessary. You protect those stones, Riona. Don't let my weakness be what destroys everything. Owen, promise me. Promise you'll do whatever it takes." She promised, and watched him drive away, wondering if she'd just seen him for the last time. That night, Riona made preparations. She studied the ritual instructions until she had them memorized. She gathered the supplies she'd need: candles, salt, items from her grandfather's trunk that the journal specified, and she wrapped the binding cord around her waist under her jacket, feeling its warmth against her skin like a promise or a warning. Ash led her to the eastern stone first, the one at Granite Ridge. They approached carefully, and Riona felt relief when she saw it still standing, carvings intact. No sign of the black corruption that had marked the broken stones. They stayed there through the night, keeping watch. The forest around them was unnaturally quiet. No animals, no wind, just oppressive silence. The pendant against her chest was so cold it burned, and periodically she'd see movement in the darkness. Shadows that shouldn't exist, shapes that hurt to look at directly. Around 3 a.m, she heard footsteps approaching through the trees. She raised her rifle, finger on the trigger, heart pounding. Ash's hackles were raised, a continuous growl rumbling from its chest. A figure emerged from the darkness, and Riona's breath caught. It was Vincent Thorne, but he looked different. His expensive clothes were torn and dirty, and his eyes glowed with the same sick light as Owen's brand. But where Owen fought the compulsion, Thorne seemed to embrace it. They reached Blackwater Creek 20 minutes later, both of them running at a pace that should have been impossible to maintain. But Riona found reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, and Ash moved through the forest like smoke, leading her by the fastest route. The southern boundary stone sat in a small clearing beside the creek, and even from a distance, Riona could see the ritual circle drawn around it. Candles burned at cardinal points, their flames an unnatural green. And standing in the center, arms raised and speaking words in that same unknown language, was Owen. "No," Riona breathed. The old man's eyes were vacant, his movements mechanical. The brand on his shoulder blazed so bright it cast shadows, and his voice carried power that made the air itself vibrate. In his hands he held a sledgehammer, and even as Riona watched, he brought it down on the boundary stone. The impact sent cracked spiderwebbing through the ancient marker. The symbols carved into its surface flickered and dimmed. "Owen, stop!" Riona shouted, raising her rifle. But she couldn't shoot him. Wouldn't shoot him. This wasn't his choice. He was being controlled, used as a puppet by the entity he'd spent 40 years trying to resist. Owen's head turned toward her with jerking, unnatural movements. When he spoke, his voice held layers, his own, pleading and desperate, underneath something else that was old and hungry and triumphant. "Run. Riona, please run," Owen's true voice, barely audible beneath the entity's control. Then the other voice took over completely. "The last guardian, the final bloodline. How fitting that you've come to witness the seals breaking." Ash growled and began to circle, looking for an opening. But Owen, or what controlled him, tracked the wolf's movements with inhuman precision, and the bound one, the traitor who chose captivity over freedom. The entity's voice coming from Owen's mouth was terrible to hear. "I remember when you were human. Remember when you made your bargain and sealed yourself into that form. Did you think it would be forever? Did you think I wouldn't eventually find a way to break you too? Riona's mind reeled. Ash had been human, one of the original 7 who'd created the seal. The wolf's response was to launch at Owen, but the old man moved with that same impossible speed Thorn had shown, sidestepping and bringing the sledgehammer down toward Ash's skull. Riona fired, aiming for Owen's leg, hoping to wound without killing, but the bullet veered off course mid-flight, as if deflected by invisible force. "Your weapons are useless here," the entity said through Owen. "This ground is mine now. Has been mine since your grandfather failed and left the ritual incomplete. Another blow to the stone, more cracks spreading. One more strike and this marker falls. And with it the last barrier keeping me contained. Fight it, Owen," Riona shouted. "I know you're still in there. Fight!" For just a moment Owen's eyes cleared. His body trembled with the effort of resistance, and tears ran down his weathered face. "I can't, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Riona, it's too strong. I can't." The entity reasserted control, and Owen raised the sledgehammer for the final blow. Riona did the only thing she could think of. She pulled out the binding cord and threw it at Owen, just as she'd done with Thorn. But this time the cord fell to the ground at Owen's feet, inert. No blazing heat, no supernatural binding. The old man kicked it aside, without even slowing his motion. "Did you think the same trick would work twice?" The entity's laughter was cruel. "Owen's binding runs far deeper than that fool Thorn's. He's been mine for 40 years, his soul so tangled with mine that to free him would kill him. The cord knows this. It won't act against what cannot be saved." The sledgehammer began its descent toward the stone, and Ash transformed. There was no other word for what happened. One moment the wolf was there, grey and massive and snarling. The next, light exploded from its form, pure and white and blinding. Riona fell back, covering her eyes, and when the brilliance faded, a man stood where Ash had been. He was old, but strong, with silver hair and eyes that still held that amber glow. And his face, Riona knew that face from photographs, from distant childhood memories, from dreams she'd thought were just imagination. Grandfather? The word came out as barely a whisper. He looked at her, and his expression held profound sadness and unmistakable love. When he spoke, his voice was the same one she'd heard in her mind, but now fully human and achingly familiar. "I'm sorry, little bird. I wanted to tell you, but the binding prevents us from speaking in our true forms, except at moments of greatest need." He turned to face Owen, who had frozen mid-swing, the entity's control momentarily disrupted by shock. "And this is such a moment. You're dead," Owen said, but it was his own voice now, full of wonder and horror. "I found your body. We buried you. You buried what was left after the transformation. When I failed the ritual 25 years ago, when the entity pulled me through the veil, I made a choice." Riona's grandfather, Ash, spoke with calm certainty. "I let it consume my human form, but I bound my spirit to the Guardian's purpose. Became what the original 7 had become. A wolf of the mountains, a keeper of the seal." "Then you've been watching over her all this time," Owen said, and tears ran freely down his face. "All these years you've been protecting her, as long as I could. But my power is limited, and the seal is breaking. I needed her to understand, to learn, to be ready to finish what I started." He looked at Riona. "I couldn't speak to you plainly until now, because the transformation comes with rules, with restrictions. But those restrictions break when the seal is on the verge of complete failure." Riona's mind was reeling, but through the shock, understanding dawned. "You saved me from the quicksand on purpose. Let yourself be trapped so I'd find you, rescue you, so you could get close to me without revealing what you were too soon. You weren't ready then. You needed to discover the truth gradually, to build your conviction, to choose this path willingly, not because I commanded it." He moved toward her, each step clearly causing him pain. The transformation was fading. She could see fur beginning to show through his skin, his features starting to blur back toward wolf. "And you have chosen it. You've studied the ritual, gathered the tools. You know what must be done." "The sacrifice," Riona said. The binding of spirit to purpose. Yes, but not death, transformation. What I did, what the original seven did. You give up your human form and become a guardian permanently. Bound to these mountains, to the seal, to maintaining the barrier for all time. His form was shifting faster now, wolf and man blurring together. It's the only way to complete the ritual. The only way to repair what was broken. No. Owen's voice small and broken. There has to be another way. There isn't. Riona's grandfather was more wolf than man now, dropping to all fours as the transformation completed. But his voice still reached her mind, clear and strong. And we're out of time. Owen can't resist much longer, and when the entity takes control again, it will finish breaking this stone. You must begin the ritual now. I don't know how. Riona's voice cracked with desperation. Yes, you do. Your blood knows. The pendant knows. The binding cord knows. Trust yourself, little bird. Trust what you've inherited. Owen was struggling against the entity's control, his whole body shaking with the effort. Riona, listen to me. Before it takes me again, the ritual, it requires your willing consent spoken 3 times. And it requires a sacrifice of blood at each remaining boundary stone. Without both stones intact, you can't complete it. Which means he screamed as the entity reasserted dominance, and his hand clenched around the sledgehammer again. Which means I have to protect this stone long enough to perform the ritual here, then get to the eastern stone and do it again, Riona finished. She looked at her grandfather, at the wolf he'd become, at the choice he'd made to save these mountains and protect her. And then I become like you. I give up my human life to maintain the seal. Ash's wolf form pressed against her leg, and she felt warmth and approval flow through the contact. Not pressure, not demand, just acceptance of whatever choice she made. Owen brought the sledgehammer down, and this time when it struck, the boundary stone split down the middle. The symbols flickered and went dark, and from the crack, something began to seep through, that same black, oily substance she'd seen on the other broken stones, but moving now, alive, reaching out like grasping fingers. Too late, the entity said through Owen, its voice full of triumph. The southern stone is broken. Even if you reach the eastern marker, even if you perform your little ritual, it won't be enough. The seal requires all 7 stones. It always has. Riona felt despair crash over her like a wave. All of this, all the sacrifice, all the struggle, for nothing. The entity had won. The seal was broken beyond repair. But then she looked at the binding cord in her hands, at the braided hair and sinew and silver thread, at the physical manifestation of the original bargain, the promise made 200 years ago. And she remembered what Owen's grandmother had written. The cord can rebind what's been broken, not just people, not just corrupted servants, but stones. Grandfather, she said aloud. The cord, can it repair the boundary marker? The wolf's eyes blazed with sudden understanding and hope. Owen, the entity, realized what she meant and lunged for her, sledgehammer raised to crush her skull. But Ash was faster. The wolf hit Owen from the side, knocking him away, and the two of them went tumbling across the clearing. Riona ran to the split boundary stone and wrapped the binding cord around it, pulling it tight across the crack. The moment the cord touched the stone, it began to glow. The heat was intense, burning her hands, but she held on, and spoke the first words of the ritual that her blood somehow knew, that rose from some deep ancestral memory she didn't fully understand. The black substance recoiled from the cord's light, and the crack began, slowly, impossibly, to close. Behind her, Owen screamed with 2 voices as her grandfather fought to keep him away from Riona and the healing stone. And from deep in the earth, from Vale Hollow itself, came an answering scream of rage that shook the mountains and sent every animal in the forest running in terror. The entity knew it was being denied its freedom, and it was not going to let that happen without a fight. The binding cord blazed white-hot as it knit the broken stone back together, but the process was agonizingly slow. Riona held on despite the pain, despite her palms blistering and the smell of her own burning flesh, speaking words in a language she'd never learned but somehow knew. Each syllable felt like it was being pulled from the deepest part of her soul, from memories that weren't hers but belonged to every ancestor who'd walked these mountains. Behind her, Owen and Ash struggled. The old man fought with strength no 70-year-old should possess, empowered by the entity's desperation. He'd lost the sledgehammer, but his hands had become weapons themselves, fingers curled into claws that raked across Ash's fur and left bloody furrows. The wolf fought back with everything he had, using his weight and momentum to keep Owen away from Riona and the stone. But Ash was tiring. 25 years in wolf form had taken its toll, and the transformation back to human, even briefly, had cost him dearly. His movements were getting slower, his responses less precise. "Hurry!" he called to her, his voice strained even in her mind. I can't hold him much longer. The crack in the stone was halfway closed now, the symbols beginning to glow again as the binding cord worked its ancient magic. But Riona could feel the cord itself weakening. It had been used twice already tonight, on Thorn, and now this. How many more times could it heal before its power ran out? The pendant against her chest suddenly flared ice cold, and Riona heard Tamsin's voice cutting through the chaos. "Federal agents! Drop your weapons and what in God's name?" The ranger stood at the edge of the clearing with 2 FBI agents behind her, all 3 of them staring in shock at the scene before them. Owen and a massive wolf locked in combat. Riona holding a glowing rope around a cracked stone that pulsed with otherworldly light, and the air itself seeming to shimmer with power. "Tamsin, stay back," Riona shouted. "You can't help here," but the distraction was enough. Owen broke free from Ash and lunged for one of the agent's guns. He moved too fast, too precisely, and before anyone could react, he had the weapon and was aiming it at Riona. "Let the cord go," the entity said through Owen's mouth. "Let it go and I'll spare her. I'll spare all of them. You have my word." "Your word means nothing," Riona said, not releasing her grip. The stone was 3/4 healed now. "Just a little longer. Then I'll kill everyone here and take what I want from your corpse." Owen's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot echoed across the clearing, impossibly loud. But it wasn't Riona who fell. Owen staggered, looking down at the red bloom spreading across his chest. Behind him, Tamsin stood with her service weapon raised, her face pale but determined. "I don't know what's happening here," the ranger said, her voice shaking. "But I know Owen Brierley, and whatever that thing is using his body, it's not him. It's not human." Owen, the entity, turned toward Tamsin with murder in its eyes. But before it could move, Ash was there, putting his body between the ranger and the threat. The wolf's flanks were heaving, blood matting his grey fur, but his stance was protective and unwavering. "Finish it," Ash sent to Riona. "Finish the healing and then run. Get to the eastern stone and complete the ritual. I'll hold them here. I'm not leaving you. You don't have a choice. This is what I became a guardian to do, protect you so you could fulfill your purpose. Don't make my sacrifice meaningless, little bird." The crack sealed with a flash of light so bright it knocked everyone to the ground. The boundary stone stood whole again, symbols blazing with renewed power. The binding cord fell from Riona's burned hands, and she could see it had changed. The silver threads had turned grey, and the whole rope looked thinner, more fragile. It had given everything it had to repair the stone. Owen collapsed, the gunshot wound and the entity's sudden loss of connection finally overwhelming him. Tamsin rushed to his side, pressing her hands against the bleeding chest wound and shouting for the FBI agents to call for medical evacuation. Riona stumbled to Ash, falling to her knees beside the wolf. Up close, she could see how badly injured he was. Deep gashes across his shoulders and flanks, one ear torn, and his breathing labored and wet-sounding. "You can't die," she said, her voice breaking. "Not now. Not after everything. I'm already dead, remember. This is just a form, a shell I've been using to stay connected to the world." His amber eyes held hers. "But it's time to let go. Time for you to take up the burden I've carried. I don't know if I can. You can." You're stronger than I ever was, braver than I knew how to be. Your grandmother saw it in you, even when you were small. That strength, that connection to this land." He paused, gathering strength for what he needed to say next. "The ritual requires 3 things. Your spoken consent, given 3 times. Your blood, willingly spilled at each remaining boundary stone. And a binding sacrifice, something you love, offered to seal the pact." Understanding hit Riona like a physical blow. You're the binding sacrifice I was always meant to be. From the moment I failed the ritual and became a guardian, I was waiting for you to be ready. To be old enough, wise enough, strong enough to take my place. His form was beginning to fade, becoming translucent. "I'm tired, little bird. So tired. Let me rest. Let me finally join your grandmother in whatever comes after." Tears ran down Riona's face, hot and uncontrollable. "I don't want to lose you again. You're not losing me. I'll always be part of these mountains, part of the stone and the trees and the wind, just in a different way." He pressed his fading head against her hand one last time. "Make the choice. Speak the words. Set us both free." Riona took a shaking breath and spoke, her voice raw but steady. "I consent to the binding. I offer my blood to renew the seal. I sacrifice what I love most to protect what must be kept." The pendant against her chest flared bright, and a path of silver light shot from the southern boundary stone toward the east, toward Granite Ridge where the final marker stood. "Follow the light," Ash said, his voice already faint. "Speak the words twice more at the eastern stone. Spill your blood on its surface, and the ritual will complete. You'll transform, become what I became, and the seal will hold for another generation. And you, I'll fade. Return to the earth. Sleep at last." His eyes were closing. "I love you, Riona. I've always loved you. Tell your grandmother, when you see her again in whatever form you take, tell her I never forgot her. Not for a single day. I will. I promise." Ash dissolved into light, into motes of silver that drifted up like snow falling in reverse. And Riona was left kneeling on cold ground, her hands burned and bleeding, her heart shattered, and a choice still to make. Tamsin was at her side, having left Owen in the FBI agent's care. "Riona, talk to me. What just happened? What was that thing? Where did the wolf go?" "I don't have time to explain." Riona stood on shaking legs and gathered up the binding cord. It felt almost weightless now, as if the repair of the stone had consumed most of its substance. "I need to get to Granite Ridge, now. You're in no condition to—" "Now, Tamsin. People will die if I don't finish this. Everyone in Pinecrest, everyone in the valley. Please trust me." The ranger looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "My truck, I'll drive." They ran for the vehicle, leaving the FBI agents confused and calling after them. Tamsin drove like she was being chased by demons, which in a way she was. The truck bounced over rough forest roads at speeds that should have been impossible, but somehow they stayed on the path. "Tell me what I can do to help," Tamsin said as she drove. "Keep anyone else from following. What's about to happen? It's not something the outside world should see. Not something they'd believe even if they did. And what is about to happen?" Riona looked at her burned hands, at the binding cord resting in her lap, at the pendant that now glowed with soft silver light. "I'm going to finish what my grandfather started. I'm going to save these mountains. And I'm going to give up everything to do it." The truck skidded to a stop at the base of Granite Ridge. The boundary stone was visible above them, maybe a quarter-mile up through dense forest. The silver path of light continued to shine, marking the way. "Riona," Tamsin said as she climbed out, "whatever you're about to do, thank you. For protecting us. For protecting a world that doesn't even know it needs protecting. Take care of Owen. If he survives, he deserves better than what he got. He fought it as long as he could." "I will." Riona started up the mountain, following the light. Every step hurt, her burned hands, her exhausted legs, her heart still breaking from watching her grandfather dissolve into nothing. But she climbed anyway, driven by purpose and duty and love for these mountains that had been her home. Halfway up, she felt it, a presence behind her that wasn't Tamsin. She turned to find a wolf padding silently in her tracks. But this one was different from Ash. Smaller, darker, with eyes that glowed more amber gold than pure amber. The second guardian. The seventh family's wolf. Thought lost or dead, it fell into step beside her, and she felt its presence in her mind, not words, but emotions, support, solidarity, readiness. "You've been hiding," she said aloud, "waiting to see if I'd make it this far." A sense of affirmation and something else, grief. This wolf had lost its companion guardians, had watched them die or fade one by one as the stones broke. It was alone, and had been alone for a long time. "Not anymore," Riona promised. "If I do this, if I become what you are, you won't be alone anymore." Together, human and wolf climbed toward the final boundary stone. The silver light grew brighter with each step, and Riona could feel power building in the air. The ritual reaching for completion. Reality itself bending toward this moment of transformation. At the top of Granite Ridge, the eastern boundary stone stood intact and glowing, and Riona Vale, the last of her bloodline, prepared to speak the words that would change her forever. The eastern boundary stone pulsed with silver light that illuminated the entire ridge, exactly as Ash had shown her in the vision. Riona approached it slowly, the dark guardian wolf, Marcus, she now knew his name, at her side, and felt the weight of 200 years of history pressing down on her shoulders. Her grandfather was gone, dissolved into light and returned to the earth. Owen lay dying or dead at Blackwater Creek, and she was alone on this ridge, with only Marcus and the ghost of her grandfather's final words echoing in her mind. "I consent to the binding." As she spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the ridge. The first repetition, just as she'd spoken at the southern stone. Her words seemed to sink into the eastern marker itself, making the symbols glow brighter, responding to her blood. From Vale Hollow came an answering roar, the entity, sensing what she was about to do, raging against its continued imprisonment. The ground shook, harder than it had at Blackwater Creek, and Riona had to brace herself against the stone to keep from falling. Marcus pressed closer to her, lending support and strength. Through their connection, she felt his encouragement. He'd been alone for so long, watching his fellow guardians fade one by one. The prospect of having a companion again gave him hope, even as it meant Riona sacrificing everything she'd been. She pulled out the knife her grandfather had given her when she was 18, a simple fixed blade that had served her well through 15 years of mountain living. Her right palm was already torn and blistered from the binding cord at the southern stone, the burns mixing with the cut she'd made there. She drew the blade across her left palm now, adding fresh blood to mirror what she'd given before. Blood welled up, hot and red, and she placed both hands flat against the boundary stone's surface. The connection was immediate and overwhelming. Fire raced up both arms, not the gentle warmth of the pendant, but searing intensity that made every nerve ending scream. Through the stone, she could feel the entity on the other side of the veil, and it was so much worse than she'd imagined. It wasn't just hungry, it was hatred given form. Malevolence that had festered for 2 centuries, growing more twisted and bitter with each year of imprisonment. And it knew her now. Knew her blood, her fears, her love for these mountains. It reached into her mind with tendrils of darkness and showed her what it would do when it broke free. She saw Tamsin torn apart by shadows, her screams echoing through the valley. Saw Owen's grandson burning in his store, the building collapsing around him. Saw every resident of Pinecrest consumed one by one while she watched, helpless and broken. The visions were so vivid, so real, that for a moment she believed them. "You cannot stop me," it whispered in her mind, its voice like grinding stone and breaking bones. "Your grandfather tried, and I destroyed him. Your ancestors only delayed the inevitable. Give up now, and I will grant you mercy. A quick death instead of watching everyone you love suffer first." Riona gritted her teeth and forced herself to focus past the pain and the terrible visions. "You're afraid," she said aloud, her voice steady despite everything. "If you were truly unstoppable, you wouldn't be trying so hard to break my will. You'd just take what you wanted." The entity's rage intensified, and the pressure against the seal doubled. Riona felt the stone crack beneath her palms, not breaking, but developing stress fractures that spiderwebbed through the ancient rock. "I consent to the binding." She spoke again, her voice stronger now. The second repetition. "Two down, one to go." The words seemed to stabilize the stone, the cracks freezing in place rather than spreading further. The binding cord was still wrapped around the eastern stone from when she'd arrived, connecting it to the southern marker and creating that circuit of power. But the rope was nearly transparent now, its substance almost completely consumed. It had repaired the southern stone, helped her reach this point, but it had nothing left to give. As she watched, the cord dissolved completely into silver light and was absorbed into the boundary marker. The stone blazed brighter for a moment, then settled back to its steady glow. The binding cord was gone, its final purpose fulfilled, which meant there was nothing left to help her complete the transformation except her own will and her blood. Riona pulled her hands away from the stone, gasping. Her palms were destroyed, burned and cut and bleeding freely. But the pain was distant, almost unimportant compared to what she was about to do. She thought about her cabin and the life she'd built there, thought about morning coffee on the porch and the absolute peace of being alone in the wilderness, thought about the satisfaction of a clean shot after tracking an elk for miles, the smell of pine sap on her hands, the sound of wind through the trees at night. She would lose all of that, would become something that could never sit on that porch again. Never drink that coffee, never be simply human in the world she'd known, but she would also become part of something greater, would join her grandfather in protecting this land forever, would ensure that future generations could live without fear of the darkness that waited in Vale Hollow. The choice had been made the moment she pulled ash from that quicksand. Maybe it had been made even earlier, written into her blood by ancestors who'd known that one day their descendant would be called to sacrifice everything. She was preparing to speak the final words when she heard movement in the forest below. Heavy footsteps, multiple sets, approaching fast. Vincent Thorne emerged from the tree line with 3 men she didn't recognize, hired muscle by the look of them, all carrying rifles and moving with purpose. Thorne himself looked worse than when she'd left him bound at the southern stone. His expensive clothes were torn and filthy, and his eyes blazed with the entity's power like twin coals. "You really thought that cord could hold me?" Thorne's voice carried harmonics that made her teeth ache. "I've given myself so completely to the devouring that your little tricks are meaningless. The moment you left to save the old man, I burned through those bindings and came straight here," Marcus growled, positioning himself between Riona and the approaching men. But 4 against 1, even for a supernatural guardian, were terrible odds. "You can't complete the ritual," Thorne continued, advancing slowly. "Even if you speak the final words, even if you're willing to sacrifice yourself, you need the binding cord to channel the transformation." And I watched it dissolve, watched its power drain away into the stone. He was right. The cord was gone. Without it, could the ritual even work? But then Riona felt warmth against her chest, the iron pendant, the one her grandfather had left for her with the note, "When the guardian returns, wear this." It was glowing now, pulsing with the same rhythm as her heartbeat. Understanding flooded through her. The pendant wasn't just a compass or a protection charm. It was a reserve, a backup for the binding cord's power. Her grandfather had known this might happen, had prepared for the possibility that the cord might be exhausted before the ritual was complete. All she had to do was reach it, channel its power into the stone, and speak the final words. But Thorne was already moving, pulling a gun from his jacket. "I'll kill you before I let you complete that ritual. And then I'll break this stone myself, and the devouring will be free to reward me as it promised," he fired. Marcus launched himself at the same instant, intercepting the bullet that would have struck Riona's heart. The wolf yelped and fell, blood spreading across his dark fur. But his sacrifice had bought her the seconds she needed. Riona grabbed the pendant and pressed it against the boundary stone while placing her bleeding palms back on the rock's surface. Power exploded through her. The pendant stored energy combining with her blood and her will, creating a surge that made the stone blaze like a star. "I consent to the binding," she shouted, her voice carrying across the ridge and echoing through the valley below. The third and final repetition. The symbols on the boundary stone erupted with light so brilliant that Thorn and his men fell back, covering their eyes. The silver paths connecting all 7 boundary markers became visible again. But this time, they didn't just connect the stones. They converged on Riona herself, making her the focal point of the entire seal. Thorn screamed in rage and fired again, emptying his gun toward her. But the bullets vaporized in the air before they could reach her, consumed by the power she was channeling. "No!" he shrieked.
"You can't!"
"The cord is gone! You can't complete the transformation without—" A column of silver fire erupted from the eastern boundary stone, engulfing Riona completely. The sealing fire, the same flames that had consumed the original 7 when they'd created the seal, that had taken her grandfather when he'd transformed into ash. She could feel her skin beginning to burn, could smell her hair singeing, could taste smoke and blood in her mouth. The pendant against her chest was so hot it felt welded to her skin, becoming part of her as the transformation began. This was it, the sacrifice, the change that would make her a guardian forever. Thorn, seeing his final chance slipping away, threw himself at the boundary stone with the dark metal knife he'd used before. If he could damage the stone while Riona was mid-transformation, while she was most vulnerable, he might still disrupt the ritual. But Marcus, bleeding and barely able to stand, intercepted him one final time. The wolf's jaws clamped onto Thorn's arm, and despite his injuries, Marcus held on with the desperate strength of someone who'd been waiting decades for this moment. The sealing fire spread from Riona to the stone, and then outward in a wave of purifying light. It struck Thorn directly, and the man screamed as the entity's mark on his chest blazed and then burned away. His flesh followed, consumed by flames that scoured away both the corruption and the corrupted. Vincent Thorn was reduced to ash that scattered on the wind, his final scream echoing across the mountains before cutting off abruptly. The 3 hired men, seeing their employer consumed by supernatural fire and a woman transforming into something inhuman, broke and ran. Their footsteps crashed through the forest, getting farther and farther away until silence fell. Riona was barely aware of any of it. The transformation had taken hold completely now, and she was burning away her human form, burning away Riona Vale, the woman, becoming something new and eternal, and bound to these mountains forever. Through the flames, she saw Marcus collapse, his wounds too severe. The Dark Guardian Wolf had given everything to protect her, to ensure she could complete what needed to be done, and she saw her grandfather's spirit, or imagined she did, standing beside the dying wolf, his hand on Marcus's head, welcoming him home after decades of lonely service. The fire consumed everything. Her flesh, her clothes, her human form, all of it burning away in silver flames that didn't hurt anymore. Instead, she felt weightless, free, transformed. When the flames finally receded, Riona was no longer human. The pain was beyond anything Riona had ever experienced. The silver fire consumed her flesh, burning away skin and muscle and bone, reducing her human form to ash, just as it had done to Vincent Thorn. But unlike Thorn, whose spirit had been destroyed along with his body, Riona felt her consciousness remaining, changing, reshaping itself into something new. She could hear the Guardian's oath being spoken, but the voice wasn't hers. It came from somewhere deeper, from the mountain itself, from every ancestor who'd walked this land and given their blood to protect it. Words in a language older than English, older than any modern tongue, poured through her awareness. From flesh to fur, from breath to wind, from heart to mountain, I am bound. What I was, I surrender. What I become, I accept. For the land and its people, I stand eternal watch. The words wrapped around her transforming spirit like the binding cord had wrapped around the stones, weaving her essence into something both less and more than human. She felt her form condensing, reshaping, becoming sleek and powerful and wild. When the flames finally receded, Riona opened eyes that saw the world in completely new ways. Colors were different, blues and yellows more vivid, reds muted to browns. But she could see in the darkness now with perfect clarity, could distinguish 1,000 shades of grey that her human eyes had never perceived. And the scents, oh the scents! The entire forest became a tapestry of information, written in smell. She could track the path of every animal that had passed through in the last week, could sense the health of the trees by the subtle changes in their bark's odor. He could even smell the lingering corruption where thorns' ashes had scattered. She tried to stand and stumbled on 4 legs instead of 2. Her body was different. Smaller than her human form, but powerfully built, with thick white fur that seemed to shimmer with silver in the moonlight. She had become a wolf, a guardian. The dark wolf, her companion now, approached and touched its nose to hers, a gesture of welcome, of recognition, of shared purpose. Through that contact, Riona felt its thoughts more clearly than she ever had. Not words, but pure communication. Understanding that needed no translation. Its name had been Marcus once, one of the original 7, a young man who'd loved these mountains and had given everything to protect them. He'd been alone for so long, watching his fellow guardians fade one by one as the stones broke until only he remained. And now he wasn't alone anymore. Together they turned toward Vale Hollow. The seal was complete, all 7 boundary stones glowing with renewed power, but the entity wasn't finished fighting. It threw itself against the barriers with renewed fury, making the ground shake and the air crackle with discharged energy. Riona, though she had to start thinking of herself differently now, had to accept that Riona Vale, the woman, was gone, and only the white wolf remained, felt the entity's assault through her new connection to the land. Each impact against the seal registered as pain, not physical but spiritual. The entity was trying to break through by sheer force, and if it kept this up, it might eventually wear down even the renewed barriers. She looked at Marcus, and understanding passed between them. They needed to reinforce the seal from this side, use their guardian powers to help the stones resist the entity's attacks. The 2 wolves ran together, down from Granite Ridge, moving with supernatural speed and grace. They reached the southern boundary stone, the one Riona had repaired with the binding cord, and she understood instinctively what needed to be done. She pressed her paw against the stone's surface and felt her spirit flow into it, adding her strength to the ancient magic. Marcus did the same, and together they channeled power into the marker, helping it resist the entity's battering from the other side. The entity screamed in rage, its voice so loud it shattered ice on nearby trees and sent snow cascading from branches. It knew what they were doing and redoubled its efforts, slamming against the barrier with enough force to crack stone. But the barrier held. Strengthened by 2 guardian wolves and reinforced by the newly completed ritual, the seal was stronger than it had been in decades. The entity couldn't break through, couldn't escape, could only rage uselessly against its prison while Riona and Marcus held firm. Hours passed. The entity tried everything: brute force, subtle corruption, attempts to manipulate the stones themselves. But with guardians actively protecting each marker, all its efforts failed. As dawn approached, its attacks grew weaker, less focused, until finally they stopped altogether. The entity was sealed. Truly sealed, for the first time since her grandfather had failed his ritual 25 years ago. Riona pulled her awareness back from the stone and found herself panting, exhausted despite her new supernatural endurance. Marcus looked equally drained, his dark fur matted with sweat and his sides heaving, but they had done it. The seal would hold now for another generation, maybe longer. The people of Pinecrest were safe. The mountains were protected. And Riona had fulfilled the purpose she'd been born to serve. She tried to speak, to express the triumph and sorrow and strange peace she felt, but what came out was a howl. Long and mournful and beautiful, it echoed across the valley, announcing to the world that a new guardian walked these mountains. Marcus joined her, his voice deeper and rougher. harmonizing with hers in a song of victory and sacrifice and eternal vigilance. Together their howls rose to the sky, where the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the clouds pink and gold. And from Pinecrest below, from her cabin on the mountain, from every corner of the valley they'd saved, came answering silence, the respectful quiet of a world that didn't know what had happened but felt, somewhere deep in its collective soul, that something momentous had been preserved. When the howling stopped, Riona felt Marcus's presence in her mind again. He was showing her the boundaries of their territory, the paths they would patrol, the signs they would need to watch for, teaching her the duties that came with being a guardian. But he was also showing her something else, that there would be moments, rare and precious, when they could shift back to human form for brief periods, not to live as humans, but to remember, to maintain that connection to what they'd been, even as they served as what they'd become. And he showed her that in perhaps 50 years, when the seal needed renewing again, someone from her bloodline would come, a descendant she would never meet as a human, but would guide as a guardian. The cycle would continue, as it had for 200 years, as it would for centuries more. Riona, the White Wolf, accepted all of this, accepted the burden and the gift of her transformation. She had lost her human life, but gained something eternal: purpose, power, the ability to protect what she loved, even if she could no longer live among it as she once had. As the sun broke fully over the mountains, the two guardian wolves began their patrol, moving through the forest with silent grace. They would check each boundary stone, ensure the seal remained strong, and watch for any sign of corruption or weakness. It was work that would never truly end. But it was work worth doing, and somewhere in the spirit that had been Riona Vale, peace finally settled. She had become what her grandfather had been, what the original Seven had been: a protector, a guardian, a sacrifice willingly made so that others could live without fear. The mountains had called to her, and she had answered, and in answering, she had found her truest self. 3 months had passed since the night of the ritual, and Tamsin Cord found herself making the drive up to Riona's cabin for the 15th time. She knew what she'd find, the same thing she found every visit: an empty cabin, supplies untouched, and no sign of the woman who'd saved them all. But Tamsin kept coming anyway, kept leaving groceries that would eventually spoil, kept writing in the journal she'd started as a record of events that no official report would ever contain, and kept watching the forest for signs of the White Wolf that sometimes appeared at the tree line. She'd tried explaining what happened to the FBI agents, tried to make sense of the supernatural events they'd witnessed that night. But the agents had been practical people who'd seen Owen Brierley die from a gunshot wound, and Vincent Thorne consumed by what they insisted must have been some kind of chemical fire. They'd written it up as a cult-related incident, closed the case, and left. Only Tamsin knew the truth. Only she carried the burden of knowing what really protected these mountains. She stepped out of her truck and walked to the cabin's porch, setting down her latest delivery: coffee, canned goods, batteries, things that Riona had loved when she was human, things that the White Wolf had no use for, but that Tamsin brought anyway, as a kind of memorial to a friend she'd barely had time to know. The journal she'd been keeping lay on the porch railing where she always left it. Tamsin picked it up and added today's entry in neat handwriting: March 15th. Town is quiet. No more disappearances. No more strange sounds from Vale Hollow. Owen Brierley died the night of the incident, bled out before medical help could arrive. His last words were, "Tell her thank you." I think he meant Riona. I think he finally found peace, knowing the entity would be contained. She paused, pen hovering over the page, then continued. Saw the White Wolf again this morning during my patrol of the eastern boundary. It was watching from the ridge, along with a darker wolf I've only seen a few times. They both looked healthy, alert, protecting us in ways we'll never fully understand. I left wildflowers at the eastern stone like I do every week. I know it's foolish, but it feels right. Like leaving flowers on a grave, except the person isn't dead, just changed into something we can't quite comprehend. Tamsin closed the journal and set it back on the railing. She was about to leave when movement at the tree line caught her eye. The white wolf stood there, its fur almost luminous in the afternoon sun. Ember eyes, so much like Riona's had been, regarded her with intelligence that was definitely human, definitely aware. "Hey there," Tamsin said softly, moving slowly down the porch steps. "I brought supplies again. I know you don't need them, but I figured I'd keep your cabin stocked. Just in case." The wolf's ears came forward, listening. "People ask about you sometimes." "Not many. Most folks have moved on. Figured you left town after everything that happened. But Owen's grandson came by my office last week. He's taking over the store. Said he found his grandfather's records, the ones about the keepers and the old stories. He wanted to know if it was all real." Tamsin sat down on the porch steps, keeping her movements casual and non-threatening. "I told him it was real. Told him his grandfather was a hero in the end, that he fought something terrible and won. The kid didn't really understand, but he accepted it. Said he'd keep the family records safe, pass them down like his great-grandmother wanted." She paused. "I think that's important, you know. Keeping the stories alive, even if most people think they're just folklore." The white wolf moved closer, no longer keeping to the tree line. It approached until it was maybe 10 feet away, close enough that Tamsin could see the intelligence in those amber eyes. The way the wolf's posture suggested awareness and understanding beyond any normal animal. "I miss you," Tamsin said quietly. "I know we didn't know each other long, but you were the kind of person this world needs more of. Someone willing to sacrifice everything for others. Someone who understood that some things are worth more than personal comfort or safety." The wolf sat down, and Tamsin could have sworn its expression held sadness, or maybe understanding. It was hard to tell. The town's doing better. Vincent Thorne's development plans died with him, and his company pulled out of the area. Property values dropped for a while, but people are starting to come back. Small businesses reopening. There's talk of turning the old mill into a community center. Tamsin smiled slightly. "Life goes on. People rebuild. Because you gave them the chance to do that." She stood up, brushing off her pants. "I should go. Got a patrol to finish, but I'll be back next week, same as always. And I'll keep watching over things down in the valley. Keep people away from Vale Hollow. Keep your cabin maintained. It's the least I can do." The white wolf stood as well, and for just a moment, so brief Tamsin almost thought she'd imagined it, the air around the creature shimmered. For a fraction of a second, she saw not a wolf, but a woman with Riona's features, standing in the same spot, dressed in silver light. The woman's mouth moved, forming words Tamsin couldn't hear but understood anyway. "Thank you." Then the shimmer faded, and only the white wolf remained. It turned and loped back into the forest, disappearing among the trees with the darker wolf that had appeared from somewhere to join it. Together, the two guardians vanished into the mountains they protected. Tamsin stood on that porch for a long time, watching the forest and thinking about sacrifice and duty and the choices people made when everything they loved was at stake. Finally, she climbed back into her truck and started the drive down to Pinecrest. The white wolf watched from the ridge above, its enhanced senses tracking the ranger's vehicle until it was out of sight. Then it turned to Marcus, the Dark Guardian, and together they began their patrol. The work was endless but satisfying. They moved through the forest, checking the boundary stones, sensing the seal's integrity, watching for any sign of weakness or corruption. The entity in Vale Hollow still pressed against its prison sometimes, testing the barriers, but it was weak now, contained, harmless, as long as the Guardians remained vigilant, and they would remain vigilant. For years, for decades, for as long as the mountains needed protecting, Riona, the white wolf, ran beside her companion guardian, feeling the wind in her fur and the solid earth beneath her paws. She had given up her human life, but what she'd gained was something precious, too: purpose, power, the ability to protect what she loved for all. Time, as evening approached and the two wolves settled near the eastern boundary stone to rest, Riona let her awareness expand through the forest. She could feel every tree, every stream, every creature that called these mountains home. could sense the town of Pinecrest below, its people going about their lives in safety and peace. Could feel the seal holding strong, keeping the darkness contained. Her grandfather's voice came to her then, not from outside, but from within. A memory, or maybe something more. His spirit, part of the mountains now, part of the eternal watch. Well done, little bird. You finished what I couldn't. You saved them all. And Riona, the white wolf, the guardian, the last sacrifice of the bloodline, howled her response to the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. A sound of triumph and sorrow and acceptance. A promise to keep watch, to maintain the seal, to protect these mountains and their people for all the years to come. Marcus joined her howl with his own, and their voices rose together into the night. The song of the guardians, ancient and eternal, echoing across the valley as they had for 200 years and would for centuries more. Below, in Pinecrest, people paused in their evening routines and listened to the wolves singing. Some felt unease, but most felt something else, something deeper and harder to name. A sense of being watched over, protected, safe in ways they didn't fully understand but instinctively recognized. The mountains had their guardians. The seal was strong. And life would go on, generation after generation, because one woman had been willing to give up everything to ensure it. That was legacy. That was sacrifice. That was love in its purest, most selfless form. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the night deepened around them, the two guardian wolves settled in for their eternal watch, knowing that what they protected was worth every moment of what they'd given up to protect it.